Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more Mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams.
Rain draped itself over Chicago like a tired curtain the night Jeff Fort first stepped into memory. It was the early 1950s, a season when the South Side smelled of wet pavement, coal smoke, and the stubborn dreams of families who carried entire histories on their shoulders. Street lamps flickered softly against the mist, their orange halos trembling in the wind. Beneath one of them stood a small boy, quiet, wiry, watchful, absorbing every detail with a restless curiosity far older than his age. He did not speak much. He didn't need to. In neighborhoods like these, silence taught its own lessons. Silence was how you listened. Silence was how you survived. Jeff's earliest world was a maze of narrow hallways and crowded rooms inside Altgeld Gardens. A public housing project built with hope but worn down by the weight of poverty long before he learned his first words. The buildings stood in tight rows, their walls thin, their windows rattling in the wind. Inside, radios hummed blues melodies late into the night. Conversations floated through open doors, women discussing bills, men talking about jobs that never came, children chasing moments of laughter between chores. But Altgeld Gardens also held a kind of warmth that could not be measured in money. Families borrowed sugar from one another. Neighbors watched each other's babies. Strangers became uncles and aunties simply because the world outside demanded unity. It was a place held together by resilience, stitched with stories of migration, segregation, and the stubborn insistence to live anyway. Jeff moved through these corridors with the awareness of someone older, someone studying the patterns beneath the surface. He saw how people talked, how they argued, how they protected each other when it mattered. He noticed how the older boys commanded entire rooms with nothing more than a gesture, a look, a quiet nod that sent smaller kids scattering like birds. Power. Even then fascinated him, not the loud kind, the shouting, the swinging fists, the careless noise, but the quiet kind, the kind that traveled through body language, the kind felt rather than heard. The kind that made others straighten their backs when you entered the room. As he grew, Jeff learned to read the contradictions of his neighborhood, its beauty and its heartbreak, its solidarity and its struggle. Summer days brought the heavy aroma of heat rising from cracked sidewalks, mixed with the metallic scent of the polluted Calumet River. Winter brought a cold, so sharp it ate through the seams of cheap coats. But every season brought lessons, written not in textbooks, but in the rhythm of daily survival. He watched his mother stretch groceries to last another day. He watched men leave early in the morning for work far from home, returning late with tired eyes and quiet frustration. He watched women from circles of support, holding each other together with gentle hands and weary smiles. And he watched the children, boys like himself, search for direction in a world that offered few clear paths. Inside Jeff, something began to form. A spark, a hunger, the sense that influence was not given. It was taken, molded, earned in the shadows long before the world ever noticed you. He saw how older teenagers gathered on corners, not simply to pass time, but to build identities. They created their own rules when society refused them a seat at any table. They shaped their own hierarchies, their own ways of being seen. Jeff studied them, not with fear, but with fascination. He understood instinctively that belonging meant safety, that leadership meant survival. Charisma came to him early, though he did not flaunt it. It was subtle, like a whisper carried through a room. Children followed him without knowing why. Adults listened when he spoke, even before he understood the power of his own voice. Teachers saw potential. Though they could not guess the form it would take, Jeff learned quickly that attention was its own currency, and he was rich with it, even as a child. But the South Side was complicated ground. It raised its children with one hand and tested them with the other. Opportunity was scarce. Temptation was everywhere. And the divide between right and wrong was not a straight line, but a blurred path shaped by hunger, circumstance, and generational wounds. Jeff felt these pressures even before he could name them. He sensed the frustration adults carried in their shoulders, the quiet anger that simmered beneath conversations about discrimination, unemployment, and broken promises from leaders who never returned after election season. He absorbed these emotions the way concrete absorbs heat, quietly, steadily, without releasing any sign of the storm building inside. By the time he reached adolescence, his gaze had sharpened, his instincts had matured, and the world around him was shifting. Chicago, already a patchwork of cultures, tensions, and histories, was entering a new era, one defined by civil rights movements, political unrest, and the rising voice of black communities demanding recognition. For a boy like Jeff, the city became both a teacher and a mirror, reflecting who he could become and what he could command if he chose to follow the instincts already growing strong within him. He watched how people responded to strength, how they leaned toward confidence, how they gravitated toward certainty in a world built on instability. Leadership, he realized, was not about size or age. It was about presence. And he had that, even when he tried to hide it. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the factories and cast a burning orange glow across the sky, Jeff wandered toward the edge of the Calumet River. The water was dark, murky, carrying decades of industrial waste. Yet in that moment, it shimmered under the fading light, reflecting bands of gold and crimson that stretched across its surface like a promise. Jeff stood there, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket, watching the colors ripple and twist. Something stirred inside him, a feeling he could not explain, a sense of being pulled toward a destiny much larger than the boy he still was. The city hummed behind him. The wind moved softly across the river, and for a long moment, he simply breathed, absorbing the quiet as if memorizing it. He did not know it yet, but that stillness was the final breath before the rise of a storm, one he would build, shape, and eventually be consumed by. And as the last light of day faded, the reflection of the river burned like fire, foreshadowing the blaze he would one day ignite across Chicago's streets. The city was changing again. By the early 1960s, Chicago carried a kind of tension that lived in the bones of its neighborhoods, an uneasy hum beneath the sidewalks, a quiet pressure beneath the sky. The South Side felt like a place caught between storms, holding its breath as factories closed, families moved, and new lines of loyalty began forming in the shadows. On summer nights, the streets glowed with the warm, leftover heat of the day, and groups of teenagers lingered beneath flickering streetlights as though waiting for something unspoken to arrive. Jeff Fort was one of them, still young, still searching, still restless. But even then, there was something in the way he carried himself that set him slightly apart. While others talked loudly, Fort listened. While others postured for attention, he observed the rhythms of the block with the quiet intensity of someone already calculating his next step. People noticed him without knowing why. His presence had weight, like a coin placed gently in one hand instead of tossed aloud into the air. Some evenings, he stood at the edge of a gathering, letting the ambient noise wash over him, the laughter, the arguments, the disputes over trivial stretches of sidewalk that felt like kingdoms to young men who owned nothing else. He watched the older boys too, the ones whose reputation stretched across corners like long shadows. They didn't need to raise their voices. Their silence was command enough. Fort absorbed this, memorizing the subtle ways influence moved. How a leader could shift a crowd's mood with a single gesture. How people gravitated towards certainty, even when they didn't understand its source. It was never about violence for him. Not in these early years. It was about belonging. About being seen in a world where most young men felt invisible. And it was about understanding, on an instinctive level, that North Side boys had clubs, West Side boys had crews, but kids from the far edges of the South Side had only each other. And even that held together by threads. The neighborhood shifted constantly, shaped by redlining, poverty, and the migration of families seeking safety that never quite arrived. With each passing year, the sense of instability grew. Teenagers responded as teenagers often do, by clustering together, forming small circles where identity felt stronger, where fear felt less heavy, where a young man's name could echo longer than his circumstances. Fort drifted from one circle to another at first, learning how they worked. He watched the quiet rivalries, the whispered negotiations, the small but meaningful displays of courage. He learned where the boundaries were and how easily they could be redrawn. Sometimes he walked home alone after midnight, hands in his pockets, replaying the night's interactions like scenes from a film only he could see. Every gesture carried meaning. Every word carried the weight of loyalty or betrayal. The streets had become a living classroom, and Fort, without realizing it, had begun taking notes. Gradually, boys started following him, one at first, then two, then more. It began quietly, almost naturally. A conversation here, a shared walk there. Fort had a way of speaking that made others lean forward slightly, as though his words might reveal something about themselves as well. He didn't promise anything grand. Instead, he offered presence, consistency, clarity, the kind of leadership that felt earned, not demanded. In those early gatherings, the city around them seemed to fade into a soft blur. They weren't planning an organization yet. They were simply young men navigating the same storms, discovering that unity softened the blows of the world. When they stood together on the cracked basketball courts of Altgeld Gardens, or on windswept corners of the South Side, the loneliness lifted. Their laughter carried farther. Their arguments found resolution. Their fears shrank into something they could manage. But beneath that camaraderie, something else began taking shape, something Fort was only beginning to sense. Ambition, purpose, a desire to carve meaning out of the chaos. He felt it in the way his friends waited for him to decide where they would go next. He saw it in the way they stood a little taller when he was nearby. Slowly, the fragile networks of respect and influence wove themselves around him, forming an early blueprint of leadership. Chicago's political winds were shifting too. Civil rights marches echoed through the city. New ideas about black pride, black unity, and black power drifted into neighborhoods that had spent decades carrying the weight of segregation. Young men who felt trapped by circumstance also felt the stirrings of possibility. The world was loosening, reshaping, revealing small cracks through which ambition could grow. Fort felt it deeply. He wasn't sure whether he wanted to protect his community or control it, whether he wanted to build something lasting or simply escape the helplessness he'd felt as a child. That moral tension lived quietly inside him, never loud, never dramatic, but present, like a pulse beneath the skin. Sometimes he caught himself imagining a group that wasn't just about territory, but about identity, discipline, unity, something stronger than the loose, breakable alliances he saw around him. Other times, doubt crept in, whispering to him that he was playing with forces he didn't fully understand, forces that could shape a life or destroy it. But the momentum had begun. The friendships he nurtured began shifting into alliances. The alliances began shaping into something more defined, more structured. Boys who once wandered the streets aimlessly now walked with purpose when Fort was near. The cliques of his neighborhood were evolving. subtly bending toward a new center of gravity. And somewhere in those long, humid evenings, beneath the buzz of streetlights and the distant murmur of the city, the earliest seeds of the Blackstone Rangers were planted, not through declarations or plans, but through the slow, steady magnetism of a young man discovering the power of form amid chaos. The chapter closes in the gentle quiet of a Chicago dusk. The sky bruised purple, the sidewalk still warm beneath the cooling air. Jeff Fort stands at the edge of a street he has walked 1,000 times, watching as the boys around him laugh and drift into the night. He feels something shifting beneath his feet, something he cannot yet name. He doesn't know it, but he has begun stepping into a role that will one day reshape the very ground he stands upon. The seeds have been planted, and they are already beginning to grow. There are moments in a city's history when something begins quietly, so quietly that even the people living through it do not recognize its weight until years have passed. In Chicago, during the late 1960s, that moment arrived in the form of soft conversations, restless youth, and a sense of urgency drifting like dust through the streets of Woodlawn. And at the center of that quiet swell stood Jeff Fort, now older, sharper, and carrying an intensity that seemed to vibrate beneath the surface of his calm demeanor. The nights in those years felt heavy, as if the air itself held stories that had not yet learned how to speak. Dim apartments tucked between aging brick buildings became the earliest meeting halls. Inside, the light bulbs flickered against cracked ceilings, illuminating faces both hopeful and uncertain. Fort sat among them, never above, never behind, always in the center of the circle, always listening before he spoke. Next to him, a young man named Eugene Hierston, known on the streets as King Boole, matched his presence with equal composure. Together, they formed the axis around which a generation of young men began to orbit. It started with conversations rather than commands. What do we want? What do we need? How do we protect what is ours? Chicago's South Side was changing, its pulse quickening with tension from the civil rights movement, from poverty that seemed older than the buildings themselves, from disillusioned youth who felt caught between survival and invisibility. In these rooms, where the smell of cigarette smoke layered into the worn wallpaper, Fort began stitching together scattered cliques, not with promises of domination, but with the language of identity. Outside, abandoned lots became the first gathering grounds. Gravel crunched under shoes as teenagers lined up in rough semicircles, the distant glow of street lamps stretching their shadows across the dirt. Fort walked slowly among them, not to intimidate, but to observe. He learned the way each young man carried his weight, the way fear hid in posture, the way ambition flickered in their eyes like small fires. He had a rare ability to see people not as they appeared, but as they could become. And that gift would eventually help build an empire. The Blackstone Rangers were born not out of chaos, but out of need, an improvised answer to a community overlooked by institutions and suffocated by neglect. With Hierston at his side, Fort transformed loose neighborhood groups into something resembling structure. He introduced roles, expectations, simple rules that brought order where adolescence had left disorder in its wake. These boys were not following a criminal mastermind. They were following someone who made them feel seen, someone who offered them a name, a color, a purpose. Unity became their currency, and respect, once elusive, began to take shape around them. Chicago at that time was a city layered in contradiction. Churches filled with hope stood only blocks away from alleyways filled with desperation. The civil rights struggle was stirring hearts, yet the weight of poverty kept many anchored in place. Fortress-like housing projects loomed over streets lined with ambition, frustration, and dreams too large for the narrow spaces they lived in. It was inside this contradiction that the Blackstone Rangers grew, not as a rebellion against community, but as an attempt to fill the vacuum that institutions had left wide open. Meetings evolved. What began as whispered conversations became organized councils. The Rangers were no longer just a name passed between teenagers. They were becoming a nation. Symbols formed. Colors were chosen not for aesthetics, but for meaning. Gestures and rituals created bonds deeper than simple friendship. Each detail gave the young men something to hold on to in a world that otherwise felt unstable. Fort, with his quiet voice and calculating eyes, guided these developments with an almost artistic patience. He understood something many leaders never learn, that power moves through belief long before it moves through action. He nurtured that belief carefully, shaping the mood of gatherings, settling disputes with calm logic, and presenting his vision with a blend of certainty and mystery that drew listeners in. Hierston balanced him, offering strength where Fort offered strategy, grounding the group when ideas stretched too far too fast. Together, they were the architects of a youth nation assembled brick by emotional brick. But leadership is never simple, and Fort felt the duality of what he was building. There were nights when he walked alone through the alleys of Woodlawn, the cold wind pushing wrappers across the concrete like small ghosts of forgotten lives. He wondered whether he was creating a shield or a spear, whether he was guiding his people toward protection or pushing them toward conflict. The line was blurry. Intention and consequence danced in uneasy harmony, yet the movement grew. Every passing week brought more young men seeking inclusion, some drawn by loyalty, others by necessity, a few by the promise of belonging. The streets began to whisper the group's name with a reverence that surprised even Fort. Mothers watched from windows, sometimes with fear, sometimes with gratitude, unsure whether these gatherings meant hope or danger for their children. In a city where institutions felt distant, the Blackstone Rangers were immediate, present, responsive. As influence expanded, so too did expectation. Young members looked to Fort as both a leader and a symbol, someone who carried their aspirations and their frustrations in equal measure. And while he accepted that role with a composure that impressed even his closest allies, the emotional weight settled quietly on him. Leadership began to feel like walking through deep water, each step heavy, deliberate, carrying consequences he could not yet see. Identity became the spine of the movement. Colors were worn with pride. Symbols etched onto corners spoke to unity. And rituals taught young men how to move, how to speak, how to see themselves as part of something larger. A nation was forming, not overnight, not loudly, but with a slow and steady rhythm that echoed the heartbeat of a restless generation. Toward the end of this chapter in his life, Fort found himself walking through a narrow alley behind 63rd Street, the sky above deep blue and sprinkled with faint stars. His footsteps were soft against the damp concrete, his breath steady in the crisp air. Behind him, distantly, he could hear the murmur of his name carried between young voices, the sound uneven, yet insistent, like a tide pulling at the shore. He paused, turning slightly, listening to that echo, not in pride, not in fear, but with a quiet understanding. Something had begun, something larger than he imagined, larger than the boys who followed him, larger even than the city that shaped him. The Black Peastone Nation was no longer an idea. It was a living presence, moving like a shadow stretching far beyond its point of origin. And as Jeff Fort stood in that alley, the night cold around him, he sensed what every leader eventually learns. Once a name becomes a nation, it no longer belongs to the person who created it. It belongs to history. Twilight settled over Washington Park like a tired breath, stretching shadows long across the field and settling into the quiet corners where young men gathered with uncertain purpose. The evening light shimmered against the windows of aging apartment buildings, their brick walls soaked with years of whispered stories and unspoken fears. And somewhere within this landscape, half forgotten by the city, half claimed by those who lived in its margins, Jeff Fort stood at the center, not by force, but by the subtle gravity of a man who understood how to command the shifting tides of human emotion. By now, the Black Pea Stone Nation was no longer an idea taking shape in dimly lit rooms. It was a living structure, pulsing with its own sense of identity. Fort had grown into his role with a quiet precision, learning the rhythm of leadership not through textbooks or formal instruction, but through the uncoordinated heartbeat of the streets, the tensions, the loyalties, the silent calculations that told him who to trust and who to watch. His influence spread not loudly, but persistently, like water finding every open path. Inside a cramped apartment with curtains drawn tight against the evening, Fort held another of his quiet meetings. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, the kind that curled and dissolved before reaching the ceiling. Young men sat around him, their faces half lit by the glow of a single lamp. They listened not because they feared him, but because Fort carried himself with an assurance that suggested he had already envisioned the outcome of every choice they were about to make. His voice was low, measured, the kind of tone that forced others to lean in, to pay attention, to understand that chaos could be shaped into structure if guided by a steady hand. He spoke of organization, not of bravado or reckless ambition, but of discipline. Roles needed defining. Messages needed clarity. Movement required order. His instructions were never barked or delivered aggressively. Instead, they flowed with an almost strategic calmness, as if he understood that true power didn't require volume, only direction. He was crafting a hierarchy that felt precise, almost elegant in its arrangement. Outside, Washington Park's atmosphere tightened with his rise. People felt the shift before they understood it. The streets grew more organized, less unpredictable, as if invisible lines of communication were weaving themselves beneath the surface. Boys who once wandered aimlessly now walked with intention. Groups that once drifted apart now moved with purpose. Even the conversations shared quietly beneath street lamps carried a new weight, the sense that something larger, something structured, had taken root. But with influence came pressure, silent, relentless pressure that wrapped itself around Fort's shoulders more tightly than any external threat. He felt it in the early hours of the morning, when the world held still, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic drifting over the rooftops. Leadership was not a crown. It was a heavier object, one that asked for vigilance, sacrifice, and a constant awareness of eyes watching him from every angle. He began noticing the subtleties first, the way conversations shifted when he entered a room, the way people waited for his reaction before offering their own opinions, the way loyalty sometimes carried a faint shadow of dependency. Jeff Fort was becoming a symbol as much as a leader, and symbols attracted both admiration and scrutiny. There were moments when he walked alone down the narrow hallways of apartment buildings, hearing hushed voices fall, silent as he passed, and felt the isolation that comes from becoming more idea than man. The burden didn't show on his face, but it rested quietly behind his eyes, in the weary pauses between his sentences. He sensed that leadership, once earned, demanded more than strategy. It demanded a piece of the soul. Outside of his own circle, others were learning his name. Concerned parents whispered about him, unsure whether he was a protector or a threat. Police began watching more closely, their patrol cars lingering longer near the park's edges. Community leaders debated how to engage with him. Some feared the structure he was creating, while others respected the stability he brought to neighborhoods long overlooked by the city's institutions. Politicians, always attuned to shifts in influence, sensed the emergence of a force that was too organized to remain invisible. Fort felt the shift too, the subtle friction between the world he built and the world that sought to interpret it. Yet he remained calm, moving through these pressures with the same deliberate grace he brought to every decision. He understood that power was never purely external. It was psychological, rooted in how people saw themselves in relation to him. And so he cultivated silence as much as strategy, allowing mystery to play its own role in shaping his authority. Some evenings, he would stand in the center of a crowded meeting only to drift away quietly, letting his lieutenants speak in his place. He watched them carefully, how confidence blossomed under structure, how discipline replaced chaos, how unity created a sense of belonging that felt bigger than any one man. In those moments, he sensed both pride and unease. The Black Keystone Nation was growing in ways he had envisioned. Yet its expansion had begun to form an energy of its own, an energy that could be guided, but never fully controlled. One twilight, as the sun dipped behind the city's sprawling skyline, Fort walked along the edge of Washington Park. The grass beneath his feet was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp soil. Streetlights flickered on in the distance, each one casting a small pool of light across the pathways. The wind carried echoes of laughter, fragments of conversation, distant footsteps moving with quiet urgency. He paused, staring out over the park as if the entire landscape were a map only he could read. The city stretched before him, its lights shimmering like scattered embers, its corridors alive with motion, its people caught between hope and hardship. And somewhere within this vast, unpredictable world, he had carved out a kingdom not through fear, but through structure. Not through noise, but through precision. But as he stood there, the light fading, he sensed a truth that only leaders understood. That power, once built, did not remain still. It shifted. It grew restless. It demanded vigilance. And it carried secrets that even its architect could not entirely trust. The evening wind brushed against his face, cool and unbothered. Fort inhaled slowly, letting the quiet settle around him. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new tensions, new whispers drifting through the streets. But for this single moment, as twilight deepened over Washington Park, he stood alone with the weight of his own creation, commander of a world both shaped by him and somehow beyond him. And as the darkness gathered, the city lights stretched before him like the outline of a kingdom he controlled, yet could never fully hold. The transformation of Jeff, Fort from a streetwise strategist to a recognized figure within governmental circles, unfolds like a slow dawn, casting light on the contradictions and tensions that would define the next chapter of his life. In the mid-1960s, Washington Park and its surrounding neighborhoods were restless communities marked by poverty, segregation, and the quiet hum of ambition, of young men and women seeking order in the chaos that had been normalized. Fort, now no longer a boy but a man of careful calculation, began to navigate this world with a new kind of precision. His reputation as a leader of the Black Keystone Nation preceded him. But it was a reputation that carried multiple interpretations, fear in the eyes of some, admiration in the hearts of others, and curiosity among those in power who saw an opportunity where others only saw disorder. The first meetings with federal agents were quiet, almost surreal. Rooms were lit with the harsh fluorescent glare of institutional ceilings, a stark contrast to the dim apartments and outdoor spaces where Fort had previously held court. He sat across polished tables from men and women in suits, their voices measured, their eyes trained to record every gesture, every inflection. Fort's responses were equally deliberate, his body language controlled, a calm that suggested both confidence and calculation. The discussions were often transactional, funding for youth programs, job initiatives, and community development. Yet beneath the surface of civility, an unspoken tension persisted. Fort sensed the fragility of trust, the subtle possibility that every handshake might carry a hidden expectation or a veiled threat. He weighed each word, each nod, understanding that influence was never free, and that legitimacy demanded a different kind of authority than the streets had. As these meetings progressed, the neighborhood began to feel the effects of Fort's dual existence. Grants arrived quietly at community centers, classrooms filled with books and materials, and after-school programs offered structure to children who had known little of it. The same streets that had once been governed solely by unwritten codes of loyalty now carried the subtle imprint of sanctioned authority. Yet, Fort's internal landscape was complex. Pride mingled with unease. He recognized the potential to shape the trajectory of lives, to claim a kind of legacy that extended beyond the alleys and basketball courts of Washington Park. But he also sensed the weight of scrutiny, the constant observation, and the delicate balance between being a servant to the community and a ruler of influence. Fort's personal ambitions and ethical calculations intertwined in these years. At times he questioned whether participation in government programs represented redemption, a chance to repair what decades of neglect had broken. At others he viewed the involvement as a strategic maneuver, a method to secure resources and legitimacy for an organization that had thrived outside formal recognition. The duality was never resolved, but it was embraced. Fort learned to operate in the gray spaces between idealism and pragmatism, between advocacy and authority. He refined the art of influence, understanding that power in Washington Park now extended not just from physical presence, but from perception, from the ability to orchestrate support, from the careful cultivation of relationships across ideological divides. Neighborhood reactions were equally nuanced. Many residents welcomed the arrival of funding and programs, seeing in Fort a figure who could transform the invisible into the tangible, who could make promises of opportunity real. Yet suspicion lingered. For every smile of gratitude, there was a wary glance, a reminder that authority, whether wielded through official channels or through street networks, was never neutral. Parents and youth alike understood that Fort's leadership carried both potential and peril, that the hands that offered help were also those that had once enforced rules through respect, intimidation, or loyalty. As months turned into years, Fort's political presence became normalized. Local media began to reference his name in context far removed from street life, describing him as a community liaison or a youth advocate, never quite fully capturing the breadth of his influence. Behind the public image, Fort continued to maintain the Black Pea Stone Nation with meticulous attention. Meetings were still held, hierarchies observed, and communications managed with the precision of a man who understood that true power resided not merely in visibility, but in continuity and control. The boundaries between legitimate authority and underground influence blurred, creating an ecosystem where Fort's leadership operated across dimensions simultaneously: street, community, and government, each informing and strengthening the other. The emotional terrain of this period was rich and layered. Fort navigated pride, uncertainty, and the subtle tension between aspiration and morality. He knew that the choices he made carried consequences far beyond his immediate perception. Every decision to accept or decline a program, to endorse or withhold support, sent ripples through the community, influencing loyalty, morale, and perception. He began to understand that leadership demanded patience as much as decisiveness. That influence could be cultivated over time, and that the true measure of power lay in shaping futures quietly, often without notice, rather than through spectacle or force. The chapter draws to a reflective close on a cold evening, when Fort exits a government building and steps into the muted glow of streetlights. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of wet pavement and distant industrial hums. He pauses briefly, surveying the streets he has both protected and ruled. The city stretches before him, a complex web of opportunity, challenge, and latent conflict. In that moment, Fort senses that he is walking a narrow path, one that holds both possibility and danger in equal measure. His influence has grown beyond the confines of any single environment, yet the responsibilities and scrutiny accompanying it are ever present. The narrative lingers on this quiet equilibrium, allowing the audience to feel the weight of Fort's choices, the subtle power he wields, and the fragile balance between community, authority, and personal ambition. The rise that had once felt inexorable now began to show its first subtle fractures. Jeff Fort, who had mastered the duality of street authority and political negotiation, now faced pressures that moved quietly but relentlessly, like water wearing away stone. In the early 1970s, the landscape around him shifted in ways that demanded constant vigilance. Government agencies, once tentative partners or curious observers, had sharpened their focus. Surveillance was no longer casual. Agents studied patterns, financial movements, and whispered rumors. Tracing every ripple that Fort's influence left across Washington Park, the sense of scrutiny was palpable. Even when rooms were empty or streets silent, each phone call, each envelope, carried the invisible weight of observation inside his apartments. Fort moved deliberately, but with an undercurrent of tension. He pored over coded communications, instructions dispatched to lieutenants and allies, and reports filtered through channels he had painstakingly constructed. The rooms were dim, curtains drawn against the evening light, shadows folding over walls lined with maps and notes. Every decision now seemed layered with consequence. Alliances that once felt firm began to wobble, and old confidants displayed subtle signs of hesitation. Paranoia, careful and precise, became part of his rhythm. He learned to read not only words, but silences, the pauses, the glances, the shifts in posture that revealed the unseen currents beneath the surface. Psychologically, Fort wrestled with dualities. He had always sought to uplift the community, to provide structure where chaos had reigned. But the choices required to maintain control inevitably brought compromise, shadows, and moral ambiguity. He recognized that his empire, built from loyalty and vision, now demanded sacrifices that threatened the very ideals he had championed. Quietly, he observed the expansion of rivalries beyond his direct command factions, within the organization testing limits. External adversaries probing weaknesses, and the ever-watchful law enforcement weaving a network of quiet pressure that could not be ignored. The streets themselves seemed to mirror his inner tension. Twilight fell over Washington Park with a muted stillness, a calm that carried the promise of storm. Cars passed without sound, distant trains hummed along their tracks, and children's laughter from playgrounds felt smaller, echoing in contrast to the weight pressing on the adults who understood the unspoken rules of survival. Fort moved through this world with a growing awareness that control was an illusion, that every advantage could be undone by forces outside immediate perception. His mind constantly charted possibilities, recalibrating strategies, anticipating betrayals, and attempting to hold a system that was increasingly strained under its own size and complexity. Within the Black, P-Stone Nation, subtle signs of internal friction grew. Lieutenant disagreements, whispered critiques of leadership, and the tension of managing growth without losing cohesion added layers of psychological weight. Fort's demeanor became measured and reflective, yet the quiet intensity behind his eyes revealed the burden of foresight. He understood that the choices made in rooms of calm reflection had consequences that would manifest far beyond their walls, and that the success of the organization depended on a combination of perception, persuasion, and preemptive calculation. At the same time, external pressures accumulated. Law enforcement and federal agencies moved with patient, methodical precision. Investigations unfolded not with dramatic sirens, but through slow, unyielding steps, monitoring accounts, compiling records, and cross-referencing patterns that hinted at activities they could not yet fully prove. Each report, landing on a desk somewhere in Chicago, added to the inevitability of change. Fort's sense of security, once reinforced by respect and fear, was now shadowed by uncertainty. The emotional tenor of this period was defined by restraint and reflection. Fort experienced moments of profound isolation, standing by windows and observing the muted glow of city lights, the river reflecting industrial neon in ripples, and the streets that had once been his stage now seeming to tighten around him. The weight of leadership, once carried with pride and poise, now pressed silently, a constant reminder that influence could not prevent the consequences of accumulated forces. He felt the pressure of every decision, the subtle erosion of trust, and the creeping awareness that the empire he had nurtured was vulnerable not through weakness alone, but through its very complexity. And then, as the culmination of patient scrutiny and internal strain approached, the inevitable arrived with quiet finality. Fort's arrest was not a spectacle of flashing lights or public display. It was the muted closing of a door, the echo of footsteps in narrow hallways, the gentle yet irrevocable shift of his world. There was no struggle, no dramatic confrontation, only the measured inevitability that accompanies forces long in motion. In that moment, the city, the organization, and Fort himself seemed to pause, suspended between the life that had been constructed with care and the uncertainty that awaited beyond the threshold. The descent into fire, slow and inexorable, had begun not with a blaze, but with the subtle extinguishing of the normal rhythms he had known, leaving only the quiet hum of consequence, reflection, and the shifting tides of power. Jeff Fort's time behind bars became a crucible, shaping not only his understanding of leadership, but also the very philosophy he would imprint upon the organization he'd spent decades building. Prison, with its long corridors and echoing silence, forced a reckoning that could not be avoided. Days merged into weeks, and weeks into months, each marked by the muted rhythm of routine, the slow drip of insight, and the relentless solitude of confinement. Within these walls, Fort began to study with a precision and intensity that few could perceive from the outside. Books of law, history, philosophy, and religion became his companions, offering structure and ideas that could be molded into a new framework for authority. Letters, carefully written and cautiously circulated through trusted channels, became the lifelines of influence. Each note carried not only instructions and coded messages, but also reflections on discipline, unity, and spiritual identity. The words conveyed a vision, one that blended organization with ideology, loyalty with purpose, and strategy with belief. Fort's mind, confined yet expansive, explored the possibilities of transforming a street organization into something more than a collection of territory and power, a network with principles, rituals, and a philosophical anchor. The transformation was subtle, psychological, and complex. Was this a spiritual awakening or a calculated rebranding? Perhaps it was both. The narrative lingers here, observing the tension without resolution, inviting the listener to feel the uncertainty, the ambition, and the burden of intellectual and moral recalibration. Outside the prison walls, his followers interpreted these teachings with fervor, adopting symbols, language, and codes that reshaped the Black Pea Stone Nation into El Rukn. The city sensed the shift even if few could articulate it. Streets, schools, and community centers began to reflect a cautious energy, hope mingled with apprehension. Local residents noticed meetings taking on a different cadence, youth members speaking in new, disciplined tones, and a subtle aura of purpose replacing the casual chaos of previous years. Law enforcement, ever watchful, grew increasingly wary. The organization's activities were not louder, but they had changed in character, more structured, more deliberate, and imbued with a sense of identity that made monitoring more complex. Fort, isolated yet omnipresent, internalized both pride and apprehension. He understood the weight of influence magnified by ideology. Every letter received from loyalists outside conveyed growth, obedience, and the redefinition of a once purely street-based empire into a movement with moral, cultural, and spiritual undertones. The psychological tension of leadership and absence, combined with the intellectual rigor of his confinement, created a duality within Fort, a man who was simultaneously reflective and commanding, visionary and cautious. The chapter emphasizes emotional nuance. The narrative dwells on the texture of decision-making in confinement, the smell of worn pages, the echo of footsteps in long halls, the soft rustle of paper as instructions are drafted, and the contemplative quiet that allows both insight and obsession to flourish. It examines how influence can be projected without presence, and how structure and belief can become tools as potent as any street-level maneuver or public show of strength. As months passed, reports, letters, and visits revealed that the organization outside was evolving under his guidance. Youths who had once followed casually now demonstrated commitment, wearing colors, reciting principles, and operating with a precision that mirrored Fort's new philosophy. The Black Pea Stone Nation's metamorphosis into El Rukn was complete in spirit, if not fully in form. Its members were disciplined, ideologically oriented, and increasingly confident in their leader's vision, even if that vision remained partially veiled behind the walls of the penitentiary. The chapter closes on a quiet, yet powerful moment. Fort, seated on a narrow cot by a barred window, reads a letter detailing the growth of El Rukn, the reach of his influence, the fidelity of his followers, the subtle expansion of ideology into neighborhoods he could no longer walk through. The cityscape beyond the prison is visible only in fragments, a sliver of sky, a distant train gliding along steel tracks, and the muted glow of streetlights reflecting on wet asphalt. In that stillness, the listener senses the rebirth of power, the quiet affirmation of vision, and the complex emotional reality of a leader who continues to shape a world that exists beyond his immediate control. The investigation began not with sirens or dramatic raids, but in the quiet, dimly lit offices of federal agents whose task was patience itself. The walls of these rooms were lined with shelves sagging under stacks of files, manila folders marked with dates and addresses, each one a fragment of a larger mosaic. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow that contrasted sharply with the warm, chaotic streets outside. Agents sat for hours, tracing connections, listening to recorded conversations, and deciphering coded messages that traveled through trusted networks. Every detail mattered, every repetition noted, each subtle discrepancy recorded with the meticulous attention of a craftsman. It was a slow, deliberate storm, moving invisibly, gathering momentum without fanfare, a storm whose eventual touch would be decisive yet eerily quiet. Meanwhile, Jeff Fort, confined within the narrow corridors of prison, sensed a shift in the world he could no longer physically traverse. Letters arrived with increasing delay. Trusted lieutenants seemed just slightly more distant, conversations more measured, expressions more guarded. Fort's psychological environment was a tension between presence and absence, control and uncertainty. He moved through his cell methodically, reviewing notes, cross-checking messages, and recalibrating instructions, each small action an attempt to maintain cohesion in an organization that was both resilient and subtly vulnerable. The narration captures this duality, a man who commands from afar, whose influence is extensive yet increasingly mediated by the slow erosion of certainty. Investigation itself unfolded with almost poetic quietness. Agents would sit with a single tape recorder, listening to a conversation repeated dozens of times, noticing the inflection in a word, the hesitation in a tone, the pattern behind seemingly random exchanges. Analysts would map out networks, drawing lines between names, addresses, and transactions, creating visual diagrams that resembled constellations, each star representing a person, a choice, a movement in a wider dance of influence. The narration emphasizes patience as a psychological instrument, showing how the law can advance not with violence, but with the subtle pressure of inevitability. Fort's emotional landscape mirrored the investigation's careful pace. There was no sudden panic, only a growing awareness that forces were aligning outside his reach. The quiet surveillance of his communications, the slow tightening of scrutiny, and the subtle erosion of trust among his followers produced a suffocating weight. In reflective narration, we explore the psychology of anticipation, How a leader adapts when every instruction must traverse layers of observation. How every interaction carries potential consequence. And how even small delays or deviations ripple outward with amplified significance. Fort's internal dialogue is silent yet palpable. A tension created by absence rather than confrontation. By hints and shadows rather than explicit action. We examine the social and political atmosphere surrounding the investigation. Chicago's neighborhoods continued to pulse with life, unaware of the meticulous, invisible work occurring elsewhere. Yet even in ordinary street scenes, subtle shifts could be sensed. Trusted figures being questioned quietly, meetings relocated, groups observed with a patience that eroded spontaneity. The narration draws the listener into these intersections, blending the mundane and the consequential. It portrays Fort's world as one suspended between normalcy and scrutiny, a delicate balance where a single misstep could ripple through an extensive network. Through the chapter, the narrative repeatedly returns to the psychological principle of inevitability. Every empire encounters a force beyond its immediate control. Every structure built on human ambition must eventually confront the mechanisms of society that enforce order. The federal investigation serves as a metaphor for this inexorable pressure, slow, methodical, unemotional, yet capable of producing transformation through consistency and quiet accumulation rather than spectacle. Fort's attempts to anticipate, adapt, and respond illustrate the human element caught within an impersonal, mechanical process. Scenes shift subtly to emphasize the human cost of surveillance and scrutiny. Followers grow anxious, alliances strain, and the whisper of caution passes through groups once bound by unquestioning loyalty. Even Fort's closest confidants exhibit the nuanced tension of divided attention, balancing allegiance with personal safety, commitment with prudence. The narration captures these subtleties with restraint, highlighting internal conflicts, hesitation, and the unseen emotional currents that shape behavior. These details reinforce the slow-burning tension, illustrating that the pressure applied by law enforcement is psychological and structural as much as it is operational. As the federal net tightened, Fort's influence remained resilient, yet increasingly mediated by circumstance. Instructions took longer to circulate, compliance required more negotiation, and errors were magnified by their potential consequences. The narration emphasizes his strategic mind and adaptability, showing a man recalibrating continuously, aware of every subtle shift in loyalty, timing, and opportunity. Through careful observation, listeners are invited to inhabit both sides of this quiet conflict. The orchestrated patience of investigators and the disciplined vigilance of a leader, responding to an encroaching inevitability. The chapter also meditates on the concept of fate versus agency. Fort, a figure accustomed to shaping his environment, confronts a world where control is partial, influence mediated by layers beyond his immediate grasp. Each missed message, each delayed response, each small fracture in the communication chain represents the gradual intrusion of external forces. The narration frames these dynamics poetically, a quiet storm moving unseen. Its presence felt in shadows, in delays, in subtle expressions. A force shaping outcome without dramatized confrontation. The culmination of these pressures arrives without spectacle. Fort is informed of the federal indictment not through dramatic confrontation, but through a measured conversation, a formal presentation of legal consequence. The quiet turning of a page in a life already heavy with responsibility and ambition. The narration emphasizes the stillness of this moment, the weight of words, the gravity of implication, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the next phase of influence, decision, and consequence will unfold within constrained circumstances. The chapter closes with Fort reflecting silently on the inevitability he has observed, the accumulation of forces he can neither entirely foresee nor control. Rain falls lightly on the prison roof above, echoing softly in the corridors. The city continues, unaware or indifferent, while Fort's mind traces networks, anticipates responses, and calculates outcomes. The final image is quiet yet resonant. A man at the center of an organization, constrained physically, but still expansive in thought, sensing the slow, methodical pressure of history and law moving inexorably toward him. The echo of these forces reverberates, setting the stage for the next chapter in a life shaped by both vision and consequence. Jeff Fort's life sentence arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet inevitability of metal doors sliding shut and keys turning in locks. The prison walls, once distant abstractions, became a concrete reality, enclosing him in a world defined by boundaries, routines, and the endless rhythm of containment. In the early mornings, soft shafts of sunlight would pierce the narrow windows of his cell, falling on cold floors and metal desks. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams, and distant echoes of footsteps traveled through empty corridors, merging with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Time in this space was different, stretching, folding back on itself, measured not in hours but in the subtle shifts of shadow and light, in the waiting for letters, for news, for signals from a world that continued without him. Inside this cage, Fort turned inward. He revisited his childhood, the streets of Chicago where he had first learned to command attention, where loyalty had been fragile and survival a lesson learned daily. He reflected on the formation of the Black Pea Stone Nation, the careful architecture of influence, and the years of navigating alliances, rivalries, and the delicate balance between protection and authority. Each memory carried weight, a mixture of pride, regret, and a profound awareness of consequences. Fort traced the arc of his life, noting the choices that had propelled him to leadership, the moral compromises he had made, and the moments of intuition that had saved or strengthened him. The narration dwells on the psychology of reflection, showing how confinement can sharpen perception even as it limits action. Daily life in prison-imposed structure, yet offered unexpected clarity. Fort's routines, writing letters, reviewing communications, mentoring those permitted to visit, and observing patterns of behavior among inmates, became a form of meditation. The distant voices of other prisoners, filtered through vents and corridors, reminded him of humanity in its quietest forms. Small conversations about survival, whispered confidences, arguments resolved with patience or force, and fleeting moments of camaraderie. These textures of prison life became a canvas upon which Fort measured his own thoughts, observing the interplay between control and surrender, authority and limitation. The narration emphasizes sensory detail, the metallic scent of corridors, the warmth of sunlight against cold stone, the subtle pressure of time that cannot be ignored. Psychologically, Fort confronted a duality. He was simultaneously the architect of an organization and a man physically removed from it, the subject of influence but also of constraint. Letters brought news of Rukn's activities, followers' developments, and shifts in the city he once traversed freely. The weight of knowing his reach continued despite confinement, pressed quietly on him, producing moments of pride tempered by caution. The narration highlights the subtle tension. A man whose presence is felt, yet whose physical absence imposes reflection, vigilance, and an acute awareness of mortality and limitation. Fort's introspection extended beyond operational concerns into identity and consequence. He considered how ambition, charisma, and intelligence had shaped his rise, how community, family, and circumstance had intertwined, and how the structures he had built were now moving with a momentum that could no longer be fully guided. There was no bitterness, only contemplation, the recognition that every decision carries consequence, that leadership is inseparable from accountability, and that influence is both gift and burden. The narration lingers on emotion, portraying Fort not as a myth or legend, but as a man confronting the vastness of his own impact within the confines of time and space. That even within the monotony, moments of clarity arrived. Fort would walk in the prison yard during brief periods of sunlight, feeling the wind brush his face, listening to the distant sounds of a world he once knew intimately. The city beyond the walls pulsed with life, oblivious or indifferent, while Fort mapped its movements in his mind, considering alliances, potential threats, and the psychological landscape of those who remained free. Each step, each breath, was measured and intentional, a quiet assertion of agency in a life defined by restriction. The narration emphasizes the slow, reflective pacing of these observations, allowing listeners to inhabit both the physical and mental contours of confinement. The chapter also explores the evolving sense of legacy. Fort revisited the streets, not physically, but in memory and imagination, neighborhoods where loyalty had been forged, sites of both triumph and loss, and the ever-present tension between protection and power. He pondered the stories that would be told, how history might remember him, and how his life would continue to ripple through communities, families, and organizations despite his physical absence. The narration carefully balances reflection and observation, showing how memory and consequence intertwine, how time reframes narrative, and how introspection becomes both a refuge and a responsibility. Evenings in the prison were marked by a slow, pervasive quiet. Lights dimmed, corridors emptied, and the shadows lengthened across the stone floors. Fort would often sit at his desk, pen in hand, letters unfolded before him, drafting words that would travel beyond the walls. Each stroke of the pen carried deliberation, thought, and intention. These were not messages of command alone, but reflections, guidance, and, at times, questions posed to a world he could no longer touch directly. The narration emphasizes the tactile and sensory elements of these actions, the rough texture of paper, the steady scratch of ink, the stillness of the room, the distant rhythm of footsteps fading into silence. The emotional arc of this chapter is one of acceptance and contemplation, punctuated by moments of tension and awareness. Fort confronts the limits of control, the inevitability of consequence, and the enduring presence of influence even in absence. He becomes both observer and participant in a life that continues beyond his reach, a man negotiating the boundaries of freedom, power, and memory. The narration dwells on this internal landscape, allowing listeners to inhabit the slow rhythm of thought, the reflective consideration of past choices, and the subtle emotional shifts that define long-term confinement. The chapter closes with a quiet, poetic image. Jeff Fort in the prison yard, sunlight breaking through clouds to illuminate a small patch of earth, eyes closed, wind drifting across his face, carrying faint echoes of a city, a life, and a legacy that persist beyond the walls. Time seems to pause, the world feels expansive despite enclosure, and the listener is left with a resonant sense of reflection, consequence, and the human complexity of a life lived both in command and constraint, long after the gates closed behind him. Jeff Fort's presence remained palpable in the streets he had once traversed freely, in the neighborhoods that had shaped him, and in the collective memory of Chicago itself. This chapter does not recount action so much as it traces resonance, how a single life, marked by ambition, intelligence, and moral complexity, continues to ripple outward, reaching people who had never known him personally, yet felt the weight of his influence. The tone is calm, reflective, and cinematic, allowing each scene to unfold slowly, letting the listener inhabit the spaces and emotions shaped by his story. Rain falls gently across city streets, the muted tapping against asphalt and windows, serving as a rhythmic counterpoint to the narrative, echoing the persistence of memory itself. We begin in neighborhoods long familiar to Fort, faded brownstones, cracked sidewalks, and corner stores where older residents recall the boy who became a leader. Their memories are neither romanticized nor demonized. They are human and textured, layered with both admiration and unease. These recollections float through time, sometimes tinged with nostalgia, sometimes with regret, always acknowledging the subtle power of a man who could shape destinies with words, gestures, and presence alone. Children play where street organizations once asserted dominion, unaware of the historical currents beneath their feet. Yet names, colors, and rituals remain in whispered stories, in lessons passed down informally, in the unspoken architecture of respect and caution. The narration moves to the younger generations. Teenagers and young adults speak of Fort with curiosity, sometimes awe, sometimes confusion. For them, he is myth as much as reality, a figure whose deeds are filtered through songs, anecdotes, and the mythology of street culture. The city itself acts as a narrator, revealing through ambient detail the continuing imprint of Fort's legacy, graffiti that bears faint echoes of old symbols, empty lots where gatherings once occurred, and streets that still carry a rhythm set by decades of informal rule. These images are offered without judgment, emphasizing observation and reflection. Cultural influence is examined quietly. In music, references to El Rukn and the Black Pea Stone Nation surface in lyrics and rhythms, nods to a past intertwined with struggle, creativity, and survival. Politicians and community organizers, too, navigate the landscape Fort left behind. Lessons learned, strategies adapted, and cautionary tales considered. The narration emphasizes the duality of legacy, how one life can be read as caution and inspiration simultaneously, how influence can endure long after physical presence ceases. Here, reflection deepens, exploring the psychology of myth-making and memory, and how individuals and communities interpret history through emotion as much as fact. Scenes drift between past and present with deliberate pacing. Faded photographs, tucked in drawers, capture moments of youth, strategy sessions, and communal gatherings. Rain streaks down windows, blurring the lines between what was and what remains. The narration lingers on these small details, the texture of old paper, the muted scent of aged books, the rhythm of raindrops on rooftops, allowing listeners to inhabit the world fully, as though moving through memory itself. Each image reinforces the theme of persistence, that a name, a story, and an impact can continue echoing, reshaped by each retelling, each reflection, and each emotional imprint left on those who lived with its presence. The chapter also explores the psychological depth of legacy. Fort's influence is neither wholly positive nor wholly negative. It exists in tension, a reminder of the complex human interplay of ambition, morality, and circumstance. Community members recount both aid and intimidation, solidarity and strife. The narration emphasizes subtlety and emotional nuance, showing how history is rarely binary and how the echoes of a name are complicated, layered, and multifaceted. The listener is invited to consider not only Fort's actions, but the ways in which human perception, memory, and cultural transmission shape the meaning of a life over decades. Even urban spaces carry the weight of his presence. Streets and alleys bear invisible imprints of decisions made, loyalties forged, and structures imposed. The architecture of neighborhoods, how people move, interact, and interpret social space, is subtly influenced by long-past forces. The narration highlights these textures without overstatement, focusing on observation, mood, and the lingering emotional resonance of power once exercised. In quieter moments, the city breathes with reflection. Rain on the pavement, wind through empty lots, and the distant hum of traffic evoke both continuity and change. Listeners are guided to feel the passage of time and the persistence of influence, how memory intertwines with environment, and how a name can continue shaping perception long after the person is no longer present. There is a meditative rhythm here, allowing space for pause, for contemplation, and for understanding the enduring heartbeat of legacy. As the chapter progresses, the narration returns to the human perspective. Older men recall lessons learned at the intersection of fear and respect. Younger generations adopt fragments of identity, and community dynamics subtly shift in response to past currents. Each scene reinforces the central idea that history is not merely events, but the ongoing echo of decisions, relationships, and presence. Jeff Fort's name moves like a shadow through this landscape, sometimes tangible, sometimes intangible, but always acknowledged. The chapter closes with a cinematic image, slow and deliberate, rain falling over Chicago at night, the glow of streetlights softened by mist, reflections rippling on asphalt like memories in motion. Jeff Fort's name lingers in this space, neither commanding nor subdued, present only as echo and impression. The narration emphasizes the quiet dignity of reflection, the subtle power of memory, and the complex weave of history, culture, and consequence that a single life can leave behind. In this final beat, listeners are left with a sense of reverence, contemplation, and the enduring resonance of a name carried forward through time, conversation, and the collective consciousness of a city that never forgets entirely, but always remembers softly.